Hey everybody. As always, I'm wondering if I'm live, and yes, I am. It's good to see all of you uh, here. Well, I don't see any of you. It's good for you to see me, I guess. Welcome back to another week of Build Your Spiritual Immunity, and I think we're on week 6 now of this course, and it's kind of just expanding and going. As long as we have things to talk about, we'll talk about it. And if you know me, I could talk quite a bit. I've trimmed my beard just for this video, and tonight we're gonna go into the realm of something that is not strictly, people would say, apologetics, but it kind of is. Apologetics is not just good arguments for why the Bible is true, or for why God is real, or arguments for why the Christian faith is dependable and true. But it's also a way of being able to interpret the world correctly, and using the Bible to interpret the world would be the Christian apologetic way of interpreting the world. And to paraphrase another C.S. Lewis quote, everybody's doing apologetics. Apologetics is not a new thing to you or to me. People who have never heard of apologetics are doing apologetics. So what we want to do then is do apologetics well. Maybe we're doing it poorly, maybe I'm doing it poorly, but we want to do it well. And part of doing it well is clearly our attitude and our approach. The other part of doing it well is actually being consistent with the world as it is. And I don't mean consistent as the world's values, but rather consistent with how we view the world. Do we view the world the way it is? Is the way we view the world something that is helpful and good for people, good for us? Is the way we view the world something that other people can do as well? Or are we all just kind of saying what we want to and it doesn't really make sense? So tonight we're talking about worldview. Clearly it means, like it sounds, a worldview, a view of the world. And the best way I can explain this, or the most snapshot way, is the lens through which you view everything else. All right? If I wear contact lenses, and when my contact lenses are working correctly, I do not notice that they're there. All right? If you've ever worn contact lenses, if you're constantly aware of your contact lenses, take them out. That's not supposed to be the case. When a lens is functioning, the way we think of a lens is you look through it to be able to see something clearly. All right, if you use glasses or even a camera lens, whatever you want to call it. But what if your lens is smudgy? Or, well, if you knew what the correct view was, then you'd look through the lens and say, like, there's a smudge there, I better wipe it off. But let's say you've just gotten used to the smudge. What if the smudge is in a blind spot? What if the smudge has just been incorporated into how you look at things? So you just come to assume that the smudge was always there, or rather that the world has a smudge in that one area, and there's just no way to see past it. And that is how a worldview works as well, that sometimes the way we look at the world, we're looking through something that we don't notice. That's our worldview. And we interpret the world through that. And sometimes a worldview might have a smudge in it, might have an inconsistency or something that's glaringly wrong. But if we don't know that, we just come to assume that's the way the world looks, or everybody has that smudge, or might be in a blind spot. We don't even know we're seeing something incorrectly. So what we're going to do tonight is go over the concept of worldview, what it incorporates. We're not going to dig to the bottom of this well, but we're also going to apply worldview. Apply it not only to when we encounter people who have a different worldview than you might, but also how does the Bible use worldview? Now, worldview is not a term found in the Bible, but it's a concept that's all throughout the Bible. So we're going to go to me up in the corner. Hey guys. And worldviews are like onions and ogres. And if you get that reference, you're probably my age or younger. The first thing we have to explain, all right, so we talked about this a little bit. A worldview is a lens through which you interpret and interact with the world. Everyone has a worldview, whether they know it or not. You don't have to be a philosophy major. You don't have to be an apologetics guru to have a worldview. We all have a worldview, whether or not we realize it. And I have on there the onion model of culture. Now, if you search onion model, you're going to find a lot of different people who've created onion worldview models. They have different terms. Um, they're all generally kind of saying the same thing. And we're going to walk through this. And I'm going to give you an example of it to help you understand what we're talking about. The worldviews in the center. So think of this, the central core of a person, the belief beneath their beliefs. All right? Let me say that again. The belief beneath their beliefs. So it could be something that they don't even realize is there. Remember the lens, right? Or maybe they do realize it's there, but they're not constantly thinking about it. It's just running. Kind of like, your computer software right now. Whatever you're using, Windows or OS 10, it's just running in the background. It's just running, and it's using up some of your computer's resources, and you have no clue because the purpose of it is to basically make everything else go. So, what we have then at the center is the worldview, the lens that influences beliefs. And remember, we're going to go through samples of this in a second. Influences beliefs, and those are multiple beliefs. Those don't have to even be consistent beliefs, but they're all beliefs that sprout from the worldview or how you view the world. Those beliefs create values of what you say, not only what is true, which are the beliefs, what is true, but value what is good. If you can see what is true, then you can also start to see what is good. And what is good influences our behavior. We will do what is good. We will spend our time on what is good, on accruing for ourselves the value. And finally, that ends in an environment or material reality. It's kind of a long way of saying when we discover pottery. So if you've ever been to an archaeological dig or if you've watched archaeological digs, then you know that a lot of what people are discovering when they dig through those things, a lot of it is just pottery. It's stuff that they made. That's how we figure out languages. Somebody wrote something on a piece of clay. Something was left behind. Something tangible was left behind for future cultures to see what this culture was about. Now, if you didn't write all your beliefs down on your pottery, which a lot of people didn't, then we might never really know what you really believed about X, Y, or Z. But we could probably figure out what you thought was important. If you thought decorating your pottery was important, then okay, you're a culture that valued aesthetics for some reason or another. Then we figure out why you valued aesthetics, and that's how we kind of build backwards to figure out who you were as a people. So there's a material reality that ends up being created. That's kind of the outside, what everybody sees, and what everybody sees points back eventually through those layers of onions. Points back to that center worldview. So I'm going to give you an example of this that I have completely taken from a video I saw. This is not my life story, but there was a professor who was teaching a class about worldview, and he talked about him growing up in Tanzania. I believe it was Tanzania, somewhere in Africa. And clearly, many people would say Africa is a very different place than a lot of other parts of the world. There are a lot of animistic beliefs that are still all around Africa, a lot of spiritualism in Africa, as well as major world religions like Christianity and Islam. So he started with this example. In the typical house where he grew up was not just a house, it was a complex. And around the complex, you would find the hedges are kind of a cactus hedge. That would be cactuses planted and thorny bushes planted around the complex to keep people out, right? Now, if you grew up in the West, you would think that those were planted to keep people out. That those kinds of things were planted in order to make criminals stay away. But that is not why they're planted. And this is according to this professor. Because if the idea was just to keep criminals away, then you could build a wall or you could have better locks in your doors or just reinforce the house in some way. But the reason why they were planting thorny bushes, some of Some of it could be a benefit to keep criminals away. But there was a belief that wandering spirits would go throughout the night, evil spirits. And the evil spirits were discouraged by these thorny bushes. So, in order to keep the evil spirits away, plant thorny bushes around your complex, and then they'll stay away. So, that is not a Western belief. You will not find a lot of people in Miami, well, maybe a few people in Miami actually, now that I think about Santeria, but you will not find a lot of people in, Iowa that are planting thorny bushes because they believe evil spirits will invade their house. But what was next, what this professor pointed out, was people, again, did not live in one house. You would see these complexes with 4 or 5 houses, and these houses were basically huts, a one-room thatched roof hut. Why would one family, right? This is not a collection of families. This is one family. Why would one family have multiple houses in this one complex? Wouldn't that just create, it's a complicated, why not just build one big house with multiple rooms if you're going to be having that many rooms? And this was the reason. Because in that part of Africa where the professor was growing up, there was the practice of polygamy. And the practice of polygamy was embraced and participated in. One man would marry perhaps 4 or 5 women. And he would build a hut for each wife. Not all of the wives would live in the same hut. Now, you can think of all the jokes you want about that. Like, yes, that sounds like a good idea. If you're going to marry 4 or 5 women, maybe keep them in separate houses, not just rooms. But because that was a foregone conclusion, you'd marry multiple women, the idea was, well, you build a separate hut. Then the man, the husband, spends Monday in this hut with this wife, spends Tuesday in this hut with this wife, spends Wednesday in this, and so on, and just keep rotating around the huts. And the man would end up living in each of those huts for a day of the week. Now, you have to start backing up. So you're observing artifacts, right? You have the thorny bushes. You have, okay, that's because of spirits. All right. You have the multiple huts. Okay, that's because they marry multiple women. Why do they marry multiple women? Now, if you didn't understand worldview or didn't try to dig further down for why people do things like that, why culture develops, then you might try to explain it using your own worldview. And if I were using my own worldview, or rather the worldview that is around me in Western society in the United States today, I might say something like, I guess because guys cheat. That's why. Guys just can't stay with one woman, so they have to marry multiple ones. I guess that's why? Well, yeah, but people don't do that here. And or rarely. You hear about polyamorous relationships, and you hear about some polygamous relationships, but it's not widespread. It's not embraced. There's laws against it, true. But it's not like people are trying to figure out ways to get married to a whole lot of women. If they want to sleep around, they'll just sleep around. They won't bother to get married. So why were the people in this village that this professor grew up in, why are they marrying multiple wives? Why is polygamy a thing? Well, now we get deeper. Because what they value, so we've talked about artifacts, now we're talking behavior, going outside in, behavior they marry a lot. What they value are children. They value children. Now, if I stop there, you might say, like, oh, I value children too. Yeah, but you're not marrying 4 or 5 women to have a lot of children, are you? Like, they value children in a different way than you or I might value children. Because their belief. Their belief is that you live on through your children. And not just in an evolutionary genetic way of, oh, your genes continue, through the generations. But rather the idea of your children can call upon your spirit. They can call upon the Lion King. I mean, it just came to mind right now, like in a lot of Disney movies now, but the Lion King especially. A memorable scene when Simba talks to Mufasa. Mufasa's up in the night sky. And so there's this idea that your ancestors are watching you. Your ancestors are looking down on you. They're evaluating you. Yeah, they want you to get married and have kids, I guess. Get married to multiple women, have lots of kids. But then that is how you will live on as well. So you have as many children as you can so that your name is greater, so that your memory is greater, so that you can truly live on spiritually. And that would come then to a worldview. So beneath that belief that you live on through your children, there needs to exist a worldview in which there is actually life after death. That's more of a worldview idea. That there is a perpetuity, that not only is there life after death, but a continuity between the next life and this life. Could there be a God? Maybe, maybe not in that worldview. But the idea seems to be that the spiritual is real in that worldview, and thus, since the spiritual is real, we must answer the question of, well, how do we proceed in the spiritual in that worldview? That creates the beliefs, which creates the values, which creates the behavior, which creates the artifacts. So, if you were to find that village, dig up the pottery 1,000 years from now, and you work your way backwards, you might stumble upon that worldview that they had there. But if you try to import your own worldview into those behaviors and artifacts, then you'll come to a very wrong conclusion. So worldview then is like an onion. So you could probably think in your own life how your worldview affects your environment, reality, your behavior, values, beliefs. A quick one. This is like a 50-cent worldview analysis here. And this comes from a book I read. I don't have it close to me. I don't think I have it close to me. A book I read called Desiring the Kingdom by James K.A. Smith, also known as Jamie Smith. He doesn't go into worldview that much, but he has a way of presenting the world where you can kind of start seeing how things connect. And he starts his book by kind of setting the scene for you. He says, you pull up to a large parking lot, and you park your car far away from the building, which is a giant building with giant glass windows that has one main entrance, and everybody's streaming into that main entrance. And they come into the main entrance, and there's a common area where the people can congregate and talk to each other. And then along the sides of this giant building with big windows letting natural light in, there are all these smaller rooms that have their own aesthetically pleasing elements inside, and the people wander into each location, and in each location they see a representative of that room, and they bring gifts to that representative, and they bring to that person an offering of money, and in exchange for the money, that representative offers them a tangible relic to take home. And the person who's gone in and come out, they take that tangible relic, they have a sense of satisfaction, a sense of pleasure, a sense of fulfillment, and they go home, and then in a week they go back to that same giant glass-like building. Now, you know, if you didn't know better, you might think I'm talking about church, but everything I've described is a mall. A mall is a giant glass building that has a lot of natural light coming in, has a main entrance, sometimes more than one, but typically you can think of what the main entrance is at your favorite mall. And people go in, and they will go into different shrines. If you've ever been to some cathedrals have this, different areas where you can go and pray to a particular saint. But they will go into a particular area and then exchange their money to a sales representative for a good that then makes them feel better. And that's, retail therapy is a credo of the American way. And then in a week, the high wears off and you have to go back. So we can talk about church and malls in very similar ways. And what that has to do with worldview is, why do we have so many products? Why do Americans, let's say Americans in general, if you grew up in the United States, if you grew up in the West in general, if you grew up in any country that tried to act like America or respected the United States in some way, or imbibed a lot of its ideals from movies and culture, then you probably are very materialistic. And you probably have a lot of nice stuff, or you try to get stuff. I know I do. I'm presenting this class with a few nice things in front of me. Technology that is not available to most of the world, I have at my fingertips. And what I do then to be able to get this nice stuff is, I live in a certain type of economy that not only creates this stuff, but also provides me with the opportunities to labor for money that can use to exchange. Okay, so you know how economies work. You know how it works to buy things, work for money, buy things, what have you. If you start backing up, okay, you can see the artifacts, you can see the behavior. You know, we went to the mall every week. You went on Amazon every Monday. You know, if the archaeologist starts digging up your, old plastic toys and that old computer you never sold, like that, they're finding this stuff. Like, why do they have so much stuff? You start backing up to the two beliefs that you might say you don't have, but your behavior reveals that you do have. Maybe you have a belief that a good life is one in which you accrue material wealth. And material wealth is not necessarily Scrooge McDuck jumping into a big vault of gold coins, or having a bunch of dollar bills that are just fiat currency. Like, it's just paper. But material wealth is exchanging those things for tangible goods. Tangible goods. We even use the word goods to describe them. But things that we can say are representative of things that we enjoy. It reminds me of this story. It's a book by Nikolai Gogol called Dead Souls. I'm not going to try to explain the entirety of that book. It's a fascinating book. But in this book, one character goes to another character's house, and they're going to have... This is set like 19th century Russia, so just imagine that, And the protagonist is asked to wait in the den until Mr. Sardanov, I think his name is, Mr. Sardanov is ready to see him. So the protagonist is sitting in the den and starts looking around and seeing all of these books on the shelf. And he sees a giant stuffed bear. And he sees a lamp, a particular kind of lamp. And all of these items that seem to have been curated, selected, precisely as if each item is saying, I too am Sardanov. This lamp is Sardanov. This bear is Sardanov. These books are Sardanov. So this character Sardanov is using all of his materials to try to represent himself to other people. We would call that today branding. Some people wear Adidas, some people wear Nike, whatever. But we're trying to say something about ourselves. So we're going deeper into our belief that could go, and I'm not trying to accuse everybody who likes brands of having this particular worldview, but that could go to a worldview where you believe that the material is more important than the spiritual, that you are defined by what is visible about you, tangible about you, by your image. That could go to a worldview where you think that this is the only life we live. That's the worldview that the rich young ruler had, that Jesus talked to in the Synoptic Gospels when he encountered Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He encountered a rich young ruler, and the rich young ruler asked him, what do I do to get to heaven? Jesus says, follow the commands. He says, I've done all that. Jesus says, great. Now sell all your stuff, give that money to the poor, and follow me. And he can't do it. The guy can't do it. And Jesus is presenting to him the idea that the spiritual world is much more important and valuable than the material world. Jesus makes this comparison constantly. But it is so difficult for people to follow that, to incorporate that and actually into their worldview and really believe it and act as if that's true. And thus have a material representation of their life in which it looks like they believe that and have that worldview. Now, that's worldview. We're going to go into a couple of ways to tease out worldview, like what worldview takes. So what are the kinds of questions that worldview is asking? So we know we can do the analysis of Sherlock Holmes. You find the piece of pottery, you can work backwards and say like, they believed in a lightning god. They thought that the storms are controlled by so-and-so. You can work backwards like Sherlock, right? But we all have a worldview, and this is what a worldview takes. All right, so this is a cute little acronym here. But these are the different elements of a worldview. A worldview has a theology. A worldview has a theology, what it says about God. Theology is just study of God. And the worldview could say that God doesn't exist, or it could say that God does exist. Okay, is God personal? Is he perfect? Is he omniscient? Is he omnipotent? Or is God just somebody that's a little further along than us? All of these things will drastically change how we live our lives once we have that trajectory at the very center. So a worldview is incorporating our theology, also our anthropology. What it says about people. Are people naturally good? Are people naturally bad? Are people a little bit of both? So those are questions that someone might have if you go on a date with somebody. If you want to get really deep really quickly, ask them, so do you think people learn to be bad, or are they born bad? That could reveal a lot about what a person thinks about the world. and what they will do with their life overall, what they think about people. Theology, anthropology, knowledge. A worldview also talks about like how can we know what we know. So in a worldview, perhaps there's a worldview where you feel like only the observable, tangible universe should be used to establish knowledge, or epistemology, or epistemological framework, if you want to be fancy about it. Or some people might say, well, no, we have to have the truth revealed to us from a higher source. We live in 2D world, and we need a 3D person to explain to 2D world what 2D world actually looks like. Those are all worldview kinds of questions. Those are established worldview. Ethics. A worldview talks about ethics. A worldview has incorporated within it what is right or wrong. Now that can come, these aren't sequential necessarily, but that can come from the knowledge. If we only get knowledge through scientific observation, then how do we develop ethics? Because we have ethics. Whether we know it or not, we have ethics. So your worldview informs a lot of what you think is right or wrong. And then finally, a solution. Your worldview has within it the solution, or what you think are the problem of life and the solution of life. There could be lots of problems of life, but what's the main problem? What's the main problem that everyone has? And what is the solution to that main problem? Every religion that ever existed, and I would also say every philosophy that ever existed, started with the presumption that there's a problem. If you didn't think there was a problem, you probably wouldn't bother spending so much time figuring out a solution, which seems to be what people are doing when they're doing philosophy or religion. So, a worldview incorporates all those things it takes: theology, anthropology, knowledge, ethics, and solution, or solutions to the perceived problems of the world. There is a quote here I'm about to put up from a guy named Adi Zulkadri. You've probably never heard of this guy, but if you grew up in Indonesia or you live in Indonesia, you've definitely heard of this guy. In the 1960s, I think it was the mid-1960s, Indonesia had a kind of a failed communist revolution. And if I remember correctly, it's a failed communist revolution that ended up becoming something of a right-wing coup d'etat. This a very, very strict right-wing government, militaristic government, came into place to fight off this failed communist revolution. Now, in order to eliminate the threat of communism in Indonesia, the government authorized the use of deadly force, and they recruited gang members. They recruited people who had killed for a living, basically, hitmen, to exterminate, to execute the communists. What eventually happened in Indonesia was that the definition of communist got stretched to basically anybody who looked Chinese. Because if you lived in Indonesia and were Chinese, you were probably a communist, according to the government. This ended up becoming a massive genocide in Indonesia, and I forgot the number off the top of my head, but it's at least 500,000 people that were executed. It's in the millions, actually. I don't think they've ever... Indonesia has not been very forthright with the numbers, so you can understand why. Because to this day, the men involved in those executions are celebrated as heroes. They are celebrities. They helped to eliminate the communist threat. And a few years ago, a filmmaker, Joshua Oppenheimer, flew to Indonesia to film a documentary called The Act of Killing. This is a fascinating movie. Go watch it. It used to be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it is anymore. If it's on Amazon, if you rent it for $4, it is worth $4. It's a documentary, so if you're not into documentaries, this is not going to convert you. But what he tries to do, what Oppenheimer tries to do, is find as many of these old gangsters, because they're elderly now, as he can, to not just interview them about why they did what they did and do they feel any guilt about it, but also to ask them to star in a movie that he's making, this documentarian. He tells them that he's going to make a movie based on the killings in the 60s. And he wants them to star in the movie. He wants them to play themselves in the movies and go, garrote somebody, choke somebody with a wire. on film, so people can see, how it happened and how amazing it is. He kind of sells it to them that way, that he's really trying to make them look like superstars. A couple of them fall for it. A couple of them kind of catch on what's happening. Fascinating, though, the scenes that he films like that. But there's one scene in particular where he is driving in a car with Adi Zulkadri. And Adi has figured out what this director is trying to do. And the director asks him while they're driving around. I don't have this clip, I'm sorry. He asks Adi, in Indonesian, aren't you afraid that you'll be charged with war crimes? Like if you these were war crimes that you did. According to the Geneva Conventions, that was a war crime. You were executing unarmed people like civilians. Those weren't combatants. That was genocide. Aren't you afraid of being, extradited and brought up on charges and what have you? And this is Adi Zulkadri's response. And this is the definition of a chilling response. He says this: the Geneva Conventions may be today's morality, but tomorrow we'll have the Jakarta Conventions and dump the Geneva Conventions. War crimes are defined by the winners. I'm a winner, so I can make my own definitions. And he participated in the execution of at least 500,000 Indonesians, so I have no idea how many he actually killed. But he says there, he is presenting his worldview here. The Geneva Conventions may be today's morality, but tomorrow we'll have the Jakarta Conventions and dump the Geneva Conventions. Now, Adi Zulkadri is almost definitely Muslim. That's the majority religion in Indonesia. But whatever he thinks about who God is, he believes that the rules are made by the winners. That might makes right. That is definitely a belief. What has to be underneath that worldview is that humans are on top of everything. But not all humans. Some humans are on top of everything. And if you have the worldview that the world is basically a giant dogfight, and it's the largest dog that will win. If you have that worldview, it's going to lead you to justify and rationalize and practice things like genocide. Not everyone who believes that practices genocide, clearly. But the opportunity presented itself. And without that worldview, that genocide would not have happened. Now, this is not to say, I'm not trying to smear Buddhist or Islamic countries where these things happen. There's been, I forgot the name of the people group, forgive me, but maybe 7 or 8 years ago, there was a Buddhist genocide somewhere in Southeast Asia. Buddhist people killing a certain ethnic group. And you'd think, but they're so down to earth, and well, yeah, not all Buddhists apparently. But this has also happened in Christian countries. The Rwandan genocide. There was a lot of Anglican priests who were supporting genocide. So there's a worldview there that does not really sync up with the biblical worldview, because you cannot find anything in the Bible that would justify a group today committing that kind of genocide, especially with what we know about who Jesus was and what he died for. That to be able to justify genocide in light of what Jesus taught and how he lived. There's no way to keep that consistent with that that kind of worldview with the Bible. So how do you even evaluate? So we've just been presented with a worldview where might makes right. Geneva Conventions are just a myth. They're made up. Whoever's the last man standing gets to write the conventions, apparently. Well, how do we evaluate whether that worldview is right or wrong? Is it even up to us to evaluate if his worldview is right or wrong? I hope we can say it's wrong. So how do we evaluate it? How do you evaluate a worldview? So we've seen what a worldview incorporates. We've seen how the worldview onion works, how you go from basically pottery to the core. But how do we evaluate a worldview? And there's 4 tests. These are called different things. I've used the most simple terms I could find. So 4 tests of a worldview. The first is reason. Is it intellectually coherent? Is the worldview intellectually coherent? Meaning, does it contradict itself? So, not just contradict itself in a manner of in my worldview, 1+1 is 3. Like that, not that. But does it contradict itself as far as having competing truths that both can't be true? Uh, easy example of this is the belief, and I'm going to pick on France for a second, but who hasn't, right? The belief that in brotherhood, fraternity, and equality, all right, the French motto, and having in that belief and in that system that everyone's free to live life as they want to, except for Muslim women wearing burqas. All of a sudden, you come to a contradiction. It's not strictly a reason, like logical A and B didn't equal C, but rather you now have to radically redefine what you meant originally if you are not going to apply that same quality or value, brotherhood, fraternity, equality. You're not going to apply those same values to a certain group because the way that that group expresses those values contradicts how you express those values. Now, contradiction is not a problem for a lot of people. This is not a new concept that people can have. If you've ever, maybe you have a friend that you talk to a lot, and they frustrate you because when they present how they think about life, it just makes no sense to you. It could be that it makes no sense to them either, but it doesn't really matter if it makes no sense. A great example of this is the Walt Whitman quote, where he's a transcendentalist, and he has all these very highfalutin thoughts, and they're very beautiful, but they don't really make sense with each other. Kind of like Eastern philosophy and transcendentalism and New Age spiritualism don't really make logical sense. And Walt Whitman said this: "All right, do I contradict myself? Very well. Then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." So that's a very nice way of saying I'm not going to try to figure out these contradictions and how to resolve them, but rather I'm just so magnanimous. I am so eclectic. I am so loving of the world that I incorporate all of these things and I contain multitudes. So what is it if I contradict myself? Who doesn't? You can find ways to rationalize that. But so the first test then is reason. What's the second test? Is a worldview legitimate? And this one, and I'm not trying to pick on this next person. She says some stuff that, believe it or not, I don't disagree with everything she says. So you might turn it off after you see who I'm talking about. But she also says a lot of things that just don't track well. And that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This is a very famous quote she said recently. "I think there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right." So what is she talking about? This goes back to the idea of outer experience. Does it fit with what we know of the world? That's a second test. So does it contradict itself? Does it fit within? Is it factually correct? Is it something that is not just a internally coherent, but also represented out there in the world? Is it not just true for me and true for you, but actually true? Now, very difficult to establish what is true. Pontius Pilate asked the same question: what is truth? But a worldview, though, should be able to fall into line with what we actually experience in the world. So another example of this that it's often used is the Buddhist idea of, not every Buddhist has the same beliefs, clearly, but the idea that suffering is illusory, or rather suffering is stems from desire, from over-desire of things. You suffer because you desire. So if you stop desiring, you stop suffering. So, your dad didn't let you borrow the car and go to the movies with your date. Well, if you don't desire those things, you wouldn't suffer. Which, at some level, it's like, oh, I see that. It's almost stoic. But when you have tragedy happen, when you lose a loved one, does it fit your outer experience? Does it fit the outer experience of the world that when people die, it's not a problem? That it's just an illusion, that everybody just realizes it's an illusion? Of course not. People experience real grief, not just you, but almost everyone you know. So that belief then, as far as evaluating as a worldview, seems to be, logically coherent maybe, but doesn't really reflect outer experience. And then there is inner experience. Inner experiences explain our sense of moral obligation. Now, here we're getting into a little more defined territory. Not everybody would follow me along here. But the moral obligation, or some people call it the natural law. C.S. Lewis's example of this is if you saw someone drowning in the river, you wouldn't ask if they're a family member first. You'd go get for help. You know, you have this moral obligation to help somebody drowning in a river. Now, that idea might not be as widespread as we think. There might be people who would really not care if somebody's drowning in a river. That's true. Maybe we're just all enculturated in a certain way. But where do our moral obligations come from? Whatever those moral obligations are. So if you have a moral obligation to leave weak people to die, how does a worldview fit with a moral obligation? Or our sense, or how we're using the term right now, does the worldview correctly reflect our inner sense of moral obligation? So, for example, I have a quote up here for this one, and I'm going to explain this quote. This is one of my favorite memes I've ever seen in my life. You're going to see it in a second. But the idea of nihilism, for example, that nothing means anything. Okay. If nothing means anything, why are you angry? Why get enough about anything? If everything is absurd, then why protest nuclear weapons? Who cares? What's the difference between a nuclear holocaust and just life? So we live as if there's meaning. So our inner experience is that there is meaning and there are obligations. If your worldview then tries to say that there's no meaning and obligations, you'll fail that test. It's not consistent with your actual sense of obligation. Here's this meme that I've set up that I really appreciate, and I hope you do too. I'll read it for you. This is Donald speaking to Mickey. Everything that we know and love is reducible to the absurd acts of chemicals, and there is therefore no intrinsic value in this material universe. Hypocrite that you are, for you trust the chemicals in your brain to tell you they are chemicals. All knowledge is ultimately based on that which we cannot prove. Will you fight, or will you perish like a dog? So just take that in for a second, and just Google search "perish like a dog," and that meme will pop up if you want to take this. But this is a pretty deep meme. As the person, and this kind of goes into this could be its own lesson. Donald Duck is saying that, well, everything is absurd because it's basically, there's no such thing as love. There's no such thing as morals or moral obligation. There's no intrinsic value in anything because of the worldview of naturalism would say that everything is basically just chemicals. It's all just our brain synapses firing. And Mickey points out, if that's the case, then why are you trusting the chemicals that you're just chemicals? If it's just chemicals, then why should it ever be a representation of what's actually true? That very thought itself has no value. So, Mickey says, Mickey refers to Kierkegaard's leap of faith. That phrase will never be said again. But all knowledge is ultimately based on that which we cannot prove. We cannot prove that knowledge, according to this philosophy here. So, thinking pragmatically, will you fight or will you perish like a dog? Now, I don't share the worldview that we can't prove knowledge, but that is pointing out that Donald's worldview is deficient. His worldview of naturalism does not do anything about moral obligations, and it's self-defeating in itself. Naturalism defeats itself. And the last test, practice. Does it actually work in practice? Can you live it consistently? Can you actually live this worldview? So going back to the Buddhist worldview of suffering and desire, okay, that makes sense in a suburb, but does that actually make sense in life every day? Do you have to ignore your life in order to make the worldview make sense, if you know what I mean, or your articulated worldview? And an example I have for this is a short clip. This is a 3-minute clip from the movie Children of Men, which is one of my favorite movies and one of those movies that I tell everybody to go watch. If you talk to me long enough, I'll tell you to go watch this movie. And I'm going to play this clip. It's about 3 minutes long. Let me set it up for you. Children of Men takes place in the near future, and the world, for some reason, women cannot have children anymore. So the youngest person on Earth is 18 years old. So there hasn't been a child born in 18 years. There are no children. There's 18 years and older. And most of the world has come to the conclusion that the world's going to end in 80 years or so because everyone will be dead. And the youngest person on Earth has just died, in a horrible accident. So everybody's really depressed because it reminds them that it's all going to be over soon. So the main character, he has to resolve some plot issues, whatever. But he goes to visit his brother, who is the curator of the Tate Moderne, where they've tried in London, where they've tried to scavenge and rescue salvage. That's the word. Salvage the art of the world, because the world's gone into complete disarray except for London for some reason. So they've tried to salvage all of this artwork from around the world and keep it in this one location. So Clive Owen's character Theo goes to ask his brother for a favor, and then poses a very thoughtful question to him, and his brother gives him an incredibly revealing response. Let's watch that now.
Come with me. I'm really sorry, Nigel. I just don't know who else to ask.
See what I can do. What?
You kill me. 100 years from now, there won't be one sad to look at any of this. What keeps you going?
You know what it is, Theo? I just don't think about it.
If no one's around to look at this stuff, doesn't that make this all pointless? And his brother says, you know what? I just don't think about it. And that is an expression of not being able to live out your worldview consistently. How can you appreciate art? How can you know that any of this is valuable if you cannot... if it will go into all a gutter one day, if it'll all be destroyed one day. So that is an example of that. Sorry, I'm a little thrown off because I am not sure if this video is actually live anymore. I'll probably have to edit out that section later. Coming to, we're gonna call it there tonight because I'm not really sure if I can go any further. But next week we're gonna talk about how Paul uses worldview in Athens. I apologize for this video had cut short, and I now know for the future not to do that. But we will, I'm just going to go over it now. Why not? And hopefully this will make it into the video. So as you argue worldview, these are some things you can do. According to Paul in the book of Acts. So in Acts 17, Paul's a very, very famous sermon, the Sermon on the Areopagus, which is basically where people went to discuss things and went to argue. And I'll just read from the text here. Not that. Reading from the text, Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each of us. For," and this is Paul speaking, quoting their authors, "in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of our own poets have said, of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, 'We will hear you again about this.' So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So in this story, in this scene, Paul is going up and speaking to the men of Athens, and Athens has a lot of different gods they worship. And Paul's kind of trying to evaluate their worldview. And he starts by critiquing it. He starts by critiquing their worldview and saying, if we have our being in God, then he can't be gold, silver, or stone. He points out that inconsistency in their worldview. So you say that in him we move and have our being, so you believe then that we're representations of God in some way, that God is living, that God is not inanimate. So therefore, idols make no sense, because the artifacts you've created do not accurately represent your worldview. The artifacts you create are of material, inanimate things. So how can God be an inanimate thing if we move and have our being? So he critiques the Athenian worldview. He is going in and not just saying everybody's wrong, follow Jesus, but rather you guys don't even follow your own worldview consistently. And that's really where the apologetic element and conversational element comes in here. Most people do not follow their worldview consistently. They will act a certain way and say they believe certain things, but they're really not representing what they believe. Second thing that Paul does is he presents the Christian worldview. And he tells the Athenians, in presenting the Christian worldview, it's like, you know what? I think I know who the unknown God is. It's the actual God. And if it's the actual God and there are no other gods, and these idols are literally just stone and wood, then this makes more sense with the idea that in him we move and have our being. The Christian God actually fulfills that belief for you. That worldview, the Christian worldview, the biblical one, would make more sense with your belief and value that we exist in God, or rather that God is animating us. And then he calls for repentance. So he's basically saying to them, like, I've set out the truth before you, now repent. So in a conversation, clearly you're not going to have these kinds of like very clear-cut start-stops. But if you are speaking to a friend who, maybe you've tried to have religious conversations with them and they don't want to go there, they would like to go with talking about their own beliefs. You can just ask them their own beliefs. You don't have to pester them and make them question their beliefs. Just ask them. Get familiar with their beliefs. For example, you might come across somebody who believes that we shouldn't look to the outside world to find our value, but rather what's on the inside. That's a belief I share. That can fall within the biblical framework. Of course I believe that. That, we're not, our value doesn't come to us from material things, but rather something intrinsic. So that's a place you can agree. But then let's say that same friend who says there's this intrinsic value in life doesn't believe that, there's a God. It's like, all right, well, you could go the route of asking them, like, so then what gave us our intrinsic value? Which, you'll just stump them. The conversation might end there. Or you could point out a behavior that they have. So, for example, if they go to feed the homeless. It's like, yeah, so you say that we have this intrinsic value and you go feed the homeless. Why the homeless? Like, you have intrinsic value. How do you know they have intrinsic value? Who told you they have intrinsic value? They haven't had the same thoughts you have. They haven't done the same things you. They're not as enlightened as you. What value do they have? In fact, if one were, let's say one was a drug addict. Let's say one was a criminal. How do they have the same intrinsic value? And, from where my standpoint, they have an intrinsic value because they're created in the image of God. That any person, they have some kind of reflection of who God is. And that's where they get their dignity from. They're created by God. Now, that doesn't mean that they are, of the same exact value as maybe everybody. But that is where we can get that value. How do you give value to something that is at your same level? Value is given to you by something above you. Like the guy running the pawn shop is pricing the items. The items don't price themselves. So if in revealing, like, if you took the Christian worldview, you'd actually have a much better explanation why we should help the homeless, why we should help those who are weaker. That's a Christian worldview thing that was not everywhere. We don't have time to go into Roman history, but in Roman history we have examples of Romans wanted, I think it was Julian, this is after Christianity became legal. Julian hated the fact that Christians helped other people, not just other Christians. So Julian wanted to reform paganism and make paganism the same kind of caring, loving, and Julian was brought up as a Christian. So Julian had these ideas of like, guys, we can be loving too, we can be compassionate. And he wrote to the priests, because all the pagan priests were like basically just getting drunk and partying. And he said, guys, shape up, man. The Christians are making us look bad. And the pagan priests were like, why should we shape up? Nothing about the paganism we practice says we should care for weak people. Where'd you get that idea? Julian got it from Christianity. So the very thing he hated, that he was brought up with, he could not use to reform what he wanted. So he got those values from Christianity and then wanted to reform paganism with it, but paganism didn't have the right worldview to be able to put those values into. So, when in that conversation, you can substitute your worldview and say, like, man, in my worldview, those values make complete sense. Not every value you have makes sense in my worldview, but those ones that you really hold on to, dignity, that makes more sense with a biblical worldview than with the one you have. And then asking, like, hey, would you like to know more? Would you like to hear more about Jesus? Because I think Jesus really lived out those values that you're talking about, and you've got those values from him. So thank you for being with me tonight, and I'm sorry if there was a hiccup in there. I'm not even sure if anybody can see this right now. But I'll put this video up tomorrow. If it was taken down, and I'll edit out the part that got it taken down. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and remember, think about your worldview, why you do the things you do, how those things line up with the Bible, what you know to be true from the Bible. And if you don't know what your worldview is, and if you don't know what the Bible says, start at the Bible. Read the Bible and develop your worldview from there. So have a good night, guys, and God bless you all.